Hello and thank you so much for joining us on Today with Zamtel. This is the Road to Independence series as we celebrate 50 years of Zambia's freedom. I do hope you had a wonderful Easter weekend. My name is Kalumba Chikonde, your host. Now in this episode, Patience Chisanga and the crew will take us back into time as they trace the origin of slave trade in Zambia and the rest of the region. So after the break, we'll join Patience Chisanga on a fact-finding mission from Kayambi in northern Zambia through to the island of Zanzibar in Tanzania. I know you enjoy the story after this break.
I'm breaking out of my shell, I am leaving the place I knew well for well. You are. I'll tell the world my story. I'll tell the world how I found you. I'll tell the world.
Join the only network that lets you tell it your way. Zamtel-It.
Zamtel, live life today.
Thank you, Kalumba, and welcome once again, viewers, to another exciting edition of Today with Zamtel, the Road to Independence. This week, we uncover the ugly face of slavery, its main players, its effects on the Zambian nation and the world as a whole. In his book, The Zambezi and Its Tributaries, the great missionary, David Livingstone, preached against the horrors of slave trade after he was exposed to the scourge in eastern Southern Africa in the 18th century. Even though slavery was rampant and helped to shape the history of 4 continents, it is only the United States of America that has over the years seemed to have freely told the full extent of the slavery story, while other nations have opted to remain silent over the matter. This week on Today with Zamtel, we trace the slave route from Zambia to the Indian Ocean. Our journey begins deep in the Bemba land in the extreme north of the Zambian nation at Kayambi Mission and brings us to Stone Town, a historic city in Zanzibar, a World Heritage Site and a host to one of the last former slave markets in the world. The history of Zambia's participation in slave trade can be traced back to early 18th century through to the end of the 19th century when the long-distance trade in Central Africa was at its peak. According to written and oral accounts, slave trade was perpetuated by a number of merchants including the Arabs, Portuguese, Swahili, the Chikunda, the Bemba, the Lunda, the Mbunda, the Mbambari and the Luvales. In Zambia, the declaration of the Mupapa slave tree in Ndola as a national monument is testimony to the extent of this region's role and participation in the slave trade scourge. This Mupapa tree is known to have been a place where slave trade used to take place.
When you look at this place, the Slave Tree National Monument here in Ndola, it's a place where the Swahilis, the Arabs, you know, the Bembas, the Luvales, the Chikundas were active also in slave trading. So in reality, actually, this was one of the main slave trading centers that were there in Zambia. Of course, the people that were being sold from around this area, they had 2 routes. The first route was the route going to the east or northeast. When people are sold from here, they would be ferried off to Chituta port, that is on Lake Tanganyika, before being ferried off to Zanzibar.
It is believed that Swahili traders who arrived in the area during the 1880s erected a stockade on this part of the site in modern-day Ndola. This Mupapa tree provided a shaded meeting area where captives from the surrounding population were sold to the Mbunda merchants of Angola. The most affected areas linked to slave trading activities in present-day Zambia were northern, Luapula, Studies have shown that by 1860, large numbers of slaves had been procured through warfare and overnight raids. In Northern Province, Sumbi village is believed to have been a distribution center for slaves, mainly generated in the surrounding areas controlled by Chief Makasa.
Today I woke up in what I consider a credo of Catholicism in Zambia. Kayambi Mission, located about 125 kilometers away from Umbala.
The missionaries of Africa, commonly known as the White Fathers, they found themselves here because this formed also part of their territory. Because before they came here, they were in the southern part of Lake Malawi, in Ishire area. They moved up, they went through Tanganyika, and then they came through what is called Mambwe. And that was their first mission kind of year in our country at that time, Northern Rhodesia. So they stayed there for a few years, but because of the Bemba raids, you know, attacking the Mambwes and getting their property and getting the children and their wives, and also some of whom were eventually sold into slave trade. So they said there was need more to come to this part of Bemba land because they wanted to come and evangelize the Bembas.
Wars associated with the generation of slaves were prevalent, though wars connected with political interests like successive disputes and expansion of kingdoms continued. Slave traders exacerbated them for their economic gains. The Chikunda, Arabs and the Portuguese encouraged strong chiefs to wage war on weaker tribes for the purpose of obtaining slaves. Slave raiding caused disruption in many societies and unsettled situations, especially in the northern and Luapula provinces, leading to ruthless rulers and individuals equipped with firearms to establish control over large areas.
Where we are, Kayambi right now, this was a Mambwe kind of place. It wasn't a Bemba place here. So the Bembas were coming, conquering all the tribes.
Now at the mission, you can still see some openings in the wall that were used as gun outposts as a defense measure against Arab, Swahili and Berber raiding groups as they were protecting the slaves that were rescued. Now, from the design of these openings, you can actually tell that they are quite wide from the inside and really small on the outside. I'm sure this was designed like this in such a way that the missionaries would be able to maneuver with their guns as they were trying to scare off those raiding groups of people. Now, Kayambi Mission served as a haven of refuge for those slaves that were rescued from slave merchants.
When you look at this wall, this is part of the kraal that was built here, where they used to keep the former slaves after being rescued. Their first refuge was here.
With me here, I think I have one very important document as we trace slave trade in Zambia, the Kayambi Diary. It chronicles the activities that were taking place between 1895 and 1899. This diary was written by Bishop Joseph DuPont and other missionaries from the Missionary Society of Africa. Now, I will share with you some very interesting portions that give us an insight into our story. I will begin with a portion from the 17th of July, 1895. They wrote, "Our people from Mambwe leave us because they have nothing to eat, and they are afraid of the Wabemba. Brother Antoine and myself got to choose a spot for the future mission. We choose the hilltop called Kayambi, which is between two streams, the Luchewa on the north and the Chisote on the south. The flat and damp banks of these streams are more suitable for cultivation. We could have selected a higher place, but as we have so many children to feed now and to help later to settle when they grow, we are obliged to look for fertile pieces of land suitable for intense cultivation. Once our choice is made, we begin immediately to set up a building." That portion basically highlights how they decided to settle here at Kayambi Mission. Now, another interesting portion is on the 22nd of July, 1895, when they brought back a slave. They wrote, "We buy back a young slave woman of 20. Her name is Kilombo." On the 23rd of July, 1895, they again bought back another young slave. They wrote, "We buy back a young slave girl of 19. Her name is Chavala. We expect Father Gil today with some children. We leave the village of Mipini and pitch our tents where the future buildings will be. During our moving, the alarm is given. Chitumukulu over there, but as usual, it's a false report. About 3 p.m., Father Gil arrives and settles in the bush with 200 liberated slaves. Now, when the number of freed slaves kept on increasing at Kayambi Mission, the White Fathers established the first village, Ilondola village, and this is the place where we are. In this place, the freed slaves built their own homes and flourished and built their own families. In this village, it is not strange to find people with names from Tanzania, Burundi, and Ghana, as well as from the rest of the Great Lakes region, because as we know, the slaves that were freed were bought from different parts of Africa.
Kwalinshila umobale pito okufuma kumasamba ilio bale senda basha bale pita muno mwine okubatwala ku East African coast kuya bastwala ku fyalo fingi elio kuti twatila nechalenga kuti tuishibo kutila kwali usha kwali ififu kwaba ififulo fimo ifya kwata amashina ya Kiswahili.
From our tour in Mbala district, we have learned that for centuries, slave trade routes were being established by slave merchants. In his book, Where It All Began, Bishop Jean-Marie Oguez wrote that for centuries, slave trade routes were being established, and one route of significance is the Stevenson Road, which linked Lake Malawi to Lake Tanganyika at Chituta Bay.
This is a road which was used by the slave traders for carrying our people who were captured into slavery. Our forefathers, many of them were captured and were taken into slavery. So it has left a landmark that we should not forget in our area. And one of the worst slave traders was the Tip.
Slave trade was long established by the time the Portuguese ruled the island of Zanzibar, with the French and Portuguese bringing slave captives from Malawi, Congo, and Tanganyika. When the Sultan of Oman took over the island, he realized that slave trade was a very lucrative business. And then Zanzibar was developed as a main slave trading center on the east coast of the Indian Ocean.
Slaves worked in spice plantations and others were sold from the island and would be chained together and forced to carry ivory to the coast town of Bagamoyo. We took a tour of the former slave market where slaves were kept in confinement for days in crowded cellars known as slave chambers with little air and no food or toilets.
When you read the history about Zanzibar, the history of Zanzibar is based on slavery, and the biggest market for East and Central Africa was in Zanzibar as well. So we are at one of the places where slaves have been kept. The room which was looked like this, you see, was for 75 slaves. And the other one there, which is very small, was for 50, and they were stayed here for 2 or 3 days, waiting for the auction, and they used to be here for few water, few food. Actually, you can say they used their rooms as a test room, so strong slaves could survive.
Does it mean some slaves were dying under here?
Yeah, sure, because when you say 75 people, you see the room are very tiny, and they just keep them on top of each other, so you can say 50-50, half survived, half died. Children have not been taken as slaves, but maybe one of the slave trader could buy many slaves, can get an offer of 2 or 3 children. So when they grown up, they'll become as slaves as well. But they say that it depends on the age of the children, because those who were under 5 years old, they were being slaughtered. 1873, the market was closed by the English, and after the slave market being closed, the English missionaries. They bought the site of the slave market, then they built the church.
Today, the Anglican Cathedral Church of Christ now stands on the former slave market, a symbolism of the role the Christian faith played to end slavery. The long history of Zambia as we celebrate 50 years of independence has got its darker side. Between the 18th and 19th century, thousands of our people were transported to the last slave trading market in Zanzibar. These are the original chains that were used on our ancestors. At this former slave market site, women, men and children were kept in appalling conditions. Zanzibar, being the main base for slave trade in East Africa, meant that slaves were being transported from the interior of Africa to this part of Africa and later to be transported via the Indian Ocean to other parts of the world. Slaves were transported from this coast to other parts of the world in appalling conditions. Some slaves would fall ill, others would die and would be thrown overboard into the Indian Ocean. One of the most notorious slave traders during the slave trade era was Tipu. Behind me is a mansion that he built from the proceeds of slave trade. Tipu Tip, real name Hamad bin Muhammad, was a Swahili Zanzibari trader. He was known by the natives of Southeast Africa as Tipu Tip after the sounds that his many guns made. Tipu Tip built himself a trading empire that he then translated into clove plantations on Zanzibar. Abdul Sharif reported that when he left for his 12 years of empire building on the mainland, he had no plantations of his own. However, by 1895, he had acquired 7 plantations and 10,000 slaves. Slave trade was long established by the time the Portuguese ruled the island of Zanzibar, with the French and the Portuguese bringing slaves from places like Tanganyika, Congo, and Malawi. Dr. David Livingstone used Zanzibar as his basis for his expeditions into Africa and visited slave markets on a number of occasions. Livingstone used his influence, together with Sir Lloyd Matthews,